What happens when the fire you start to warm your people ends up burning down your own house? Picture a cold, concrete cell in Folsom Prison. A man sits alone in the dim light, writing furiously on smuggled scraps of paper. The air is heavy with anger and isolation. He was a nameless inmate, locked away for the darkest of crimes. Yet, those scattered papers would soon become a literary earthquake that shook the conscience of a divided nation. He rose from the ashes of a prison yard to become the most militant voice of a generation. He stood at the very peak of a cultural revolution, demanding justice with a fierce intellect that terrified the establishment. But the man who demanded freedom for his people would soon find himself running for his life in the dead of night. He fled the very country he swore to change, leaving behind a legacy tangled in blood and broken promises. Sometimes, the loudest voices carry the heaviest, most isolating silences. Before we walk into the shadows of a man who pushed the boundaries until they broke, take a breath. Let us look at the true price of a revolution. The story begins in the deep, segregated South, far from the flashing cameras and political stages. He was born in 1935 in Wabaseka, Arkansas. It was a town where dirt roads seemed to swallow the hopes of those who walked them. The weight of a divided society was placed on his shoulders before he even knew how to speak. Looking for a quiet escape from the suffocating laws of the South, his family packed their few belongings. They joined the massive wave of the Great Migration, chasing a whisper of equality out west. The train ride was long, carrying the silent prayers of parents wanting a safer sky for their children. They eventually settled in Los Angeles, believing the Golden State would offer a new beginning. But the promised land was little more than a gilded cage. The neighborhoods were divided by invisible, yet incredibly heavy lines of race and class. His father worked as a waiter in a dining car, serving meals to people they could never sit beside. The quiet tension of poverty slowly tore the home apart, leaving a young boy drifting into the unforgiving embrace of the streets. The alleys of Los Angeles offered a different kind of education. It was a curriculum of survival, written in stolen bicycles and shattered windows. He learned very early that anger was a reliable shield against a world that looked right through him. The school system failed to anchor him, and the neon lights of the city only highlighted his empty pockets. By his teenage years, the justice system had already built a heavy file on his name. Reform schools quickly replaced traditional classrooms. The concrete walls grew taller as his offenses grew darker and more desperate. He was a young man consumed by a blind, misguided rage, lashing out at society in ways that would leave permanent scars on others and himself. The law inevitably caught up, and the heavy iron doors of Soledad prison slammed shut behind him. He was no longer just a troubled youth from a broken home. He was a ward of the state, reduced to a number printed on a coarse uniform. The air in the cell block was thick with the scent of rust, damp concrete, and defeated men. Prison is an architecture designed to break the human spirit into manageable pieces. He spent endless days in solitary confinement, where the darkness was absolute and pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The silence after the heavy door locked was louder than any street riot. Many men lost their minds in that quiet terror, surrendering to the void. But in that suffocating isolation, a strange and profound shift occurred. Stripped of his freedom, his distractions, and his excuses, he was forced to look inward. The burning anger remained, but it slowly began to seek a shape, a target, and a vocabulary. He realized that physical rebellion had only built his own cage. Transferred to the maximum security of Folsom Prison, he found the only door the guards could not truly lock. He discovered the prison library. He began to read with a desperate, consuming hunger, tracing the lines of books that most inmates ignored. The words of Richard Wright, Thomas Paine, and Karl Marx offered a framework for the pain he had carried his entire life. The teachings of Malcolm X pierced through the fog of his institutionalized mind. He looked into a mirror and saw not just a criminal, but a tragic product of a fractured, unequal system. The realization was sharp, painful, and entirely necessary for his survival. He decided to trade his physical weapons for a pen, a choice that would alter the course of his life. The transition from a man of violence to a man of letters was grueling. He taught himself the rhythm of language, scratching raw thoughts on a cheap prison paper under a dim, flickering bulb. His fingers were constantly stained with ink, capturing the ghosts of his past. He wrote about his severe crimes with a brutal, unapologetic honesty that made readers uncomfortable. He dissected the racial neuroses of America with the cold precision of a surgeon. These essays were quietly smuggled past the guards, carrying the unfiltered voice of a man fighting for his humanity in the belly of the beast. The scattered pages would eventually be bound together into a manuscript. It was a raw confession of a soul trying to thaw itself from the ice of society. He was no longer just serving time in a granite fortress. He was preparing for a relentless war of ideas. The angry boy from the dusty roads of Arkansas had methodically rebuilt himself into a formidable intellectual force. The prison system had locked away a violent offender, entirely unaware that it was about to release a revolutionary. When the heavy steel gates of Folsom Prison finally opened late in 1966, a different man walked out into the California sun. The nation he returned to was burning with a new kind of fire. The polite marches for civil rights were slowly giving way to a louder, more militant demand for black power. The streets of Oakland were vibrating with a restless energy, waiting for a voice that could articulate the anger of the marginalized. He did not have to wait long to find his place in this shifting landscape. He crossed paths with a small, radical group of young men wearing black leather jackets and dark berets. They carried law books in one hand and loaded shotguns in the other, legally patrolling the streets to observe police arrests. This was the birth of the Black Panther Party. They saw in him the articulate rage they needed, and he saw in them the physical embodiment of his prison writings. He quickly became the Minister of Information for the Panthers. His job was to shape the narrative, to turn local street patrols into a nationwide symbol of resistance. He understood that a revolution needed a camera and a printing press just as much as it needed a weapon. He transformed the party's newspaper into a vital organ of the movement. His editorials were sharp, relentless, and designed to provoke the political establishment. He possessed a rare ability to bridge the gap between the intellectual elite and the forgotten youth on the street corners. He spoke a language of defiance that both the college student and the factory worker could deeply understand. Then came the defining moment that elevated him from a local radical to an international icon. In 1968, his prison manuscript was officially published under the title Soul on Ice. The book struck the American consciousness like a physical blow. It was a brutal, uncompromising look at race, sexuality, and the deep psychological scars left by systemic oppression. The literary world, predominantly white and liberal, was simultaneously captivated and terrified by his raw honesty. The book became a massive commercial success, selling millions of copies and finding its way into university classrooms across the country. Overnight, Eldridge Cleaver was no longer viewed simply as an ex-convict or a street agitator. He was hailed as a literary genius and a prophet of the urban underclass. His life transformed into a dizzying whirlwind of speaking engagements and television interviews. He stood at podiums in prestigious universities, wearing his signature black turtleneck, lecturing to crowds that hung on his every word. The same society that had locked him in a dark cell for years was now paying him to diagnose its deepest moral failures. It was a profound and intoxicating paradox. During this ascent, he met a woman who matched his fierce intellect and unwavering commitment to the cause. Kathleen Neal was a young, brilliant activist who had left her privileged background to join the struggle. Their union was more than just a marriage. They became the undisputed power couple of the revolutionary left, an enduring symbol of black love and political defiance. At the absolute height of his influence, his ambition reached beyond the streets of Oakland. He even ran for president of the United States on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He knew he could never win the election, but the campaign was a brilliant theatrical strategy. It forced the media to broadcast the Panther platform to millions of living rooms across Middle America. He was riding a tidal wave of historic momentum. He had successfully written his way out of a concrete tomb and positioned himself at the very center of a cultural earthquake. He had power, fame, and the adoration of a generation desperate for radical change. Eldridge Cleaver had convinced the world that he was untouchable, but standing on the highest peak often blinds a person to the storm gathering right below them. The federal government was watching his every move. The brighter his star burned, the larger the target on his back became. The stage was perfectly set for a devastating fall, and the cost of this fame would be measured in blood in the spring of 1968. The illusion of a peaceful revolution was shattered by a single bullet in Memphis. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. sent a wave of grief and unrest across the nation. The streets were thick with tension, and the air smelled of burning buildings and broken promises. The political climate had shifted from protest to survival. 2 days later, the simmering anger in Oakland finally boiled over into the dark. It was the night of April 6th. A routine patrol turned into a devastating ambush, trapping several Panthers in a narrow, suffocating basement. This was not a training drill. This was real. The exchange of gunfire tore through the quiet neighborhood, leaving the air heavy with tear gas and the sharp scent of cordite. Inside that basement, Eldridge Cleaver was bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his leg. Beside him was Bobby Hutton, the very first recruit of the party. Bobby was only 17 years old, a boy who had barely begun to live. As the tear gas filled their lungs and the house caught fire, they realized there was no escape. They agreed to surrender to the surrounding police force. To prove he was unarmed, young Bobby stripped down to his underwear and walked out into the cold night air with his hands raised. He was met with a hail of bullets and died instantly on the pavement. The silence after the sirens was louder than any blast. A teenager was dead, and the movement had suffered a fatal wound to its heart. Eldridge Cleaver was dragged out of the smoke, arrested, and sent back to a prison cell. The authorities swiftly revoked his parole, setting the stage for a trial that would almost certainly end in a life sentence or worse. He was faced with an impossible choice. He could stay and be buried alive within the concrete walls of the American penal system, or he could vanish. In late 1968, just days before he was ordered to surrender to authorities, he chose the shadows. He fled the country, leaving behind his wife, his movement, and the very people he had sworn to lead. His escape marked the beginning of a long and bitter exile. He arrived first in Cuba, hoping to find a socialist paradise that welcomed revolutionary heroes. But the reality of political asylum was stark and deeply isolating. The Cuban government kept him hidden away, viewing him more as a political liability than a comrade in arms. Driven by frustration, he moved his base to Algiers, where the government initially granted the Panthers diplomatic status. He attempted to build an international chapter of the movement from the dusty streets of North Africa. He hosted foreign journalists and radical delegations, trying to project strength across the ocean. But a king without a country is eventually left ruling over nothing but his own memories. Thousands of miles away, the party he helped build was slowly tearing itself apart. The FBI had launched a massive, covert operation to infiltrate and destroy the Panthers from the inside. They forged letters, planted false rumors, and successfully sowed seeds of deep paranoia among the leadership. The distance of exile made Eldridge Cleaver incredibly vulnerable to this psychological warfare. The breaking point arrived during a now infamous telephone call with Huey Newton, broadcast live on a local television show. The conversation quickly devolved into a bitter, public expulsion. The two leaders expelled each other from the party, fracturing the movement forever. The ideological brotherhood that had once terrified the American establishment was now eating itself alive. He eventually found himself drifting to Paris, a man without a movement and slowly running out of allies. The revolutionary fire that had defined his youth was turning to cold ash. He was isolated in a foreign apartment, hunted by his own government, and alienated from the comrades who once stood by his side. And in the smoke of his own burning bridges, the world simply watched him fade. While he wandered the globe, the country he left behind was consumed by his ghost. In the eyes of the American government, he was never just a runaway author. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the strict command of J. Edgar Hoover, labeled him a primary threat to national security. The files bearing the name Eldridge Cleaver grew thicker by the day. To the conservative establishment, he was the embodiment of their deepest fears. He was an articulate, radicalized man who could mobilize the masses and disrupt the social order. The government did not just want to capture him. They wanted to erase his influence from the cultural memory entirely. Through the covert operations of COINTELPRO, federal agents worked tirelessly to dismantle the network he left behind. They fueled rivalries, planted informants, and made sure that the public image of the Black Panther Party was painted strictly in the colors of violence and terror. The man in exile was rendered powerless as he watched his life's work be systematically taken apart from across the ocean. The American public, however, remained deeply fractured in their view of him. For a generation of young activists and anti-war protesters, his exile cemented his status as a living martyr. They saw a man persecuted for daring to speak the brutal truth about systemic racism in America. Thousands of miles away, however, the reality of his daily existence was far less romantic. He was no longer a leader making decisions. He was a pawn on a much larger Cold War chessboard. The international community initially welcomed him with open arms. Foreign governments were eager to use his presence as a powerful propaganda tool against the United States. He traveled through the socialist and communist nations of the world, seeking the utopias he had passionately written about from his prison cell. He visited North Korea, the Soviet Union, and China, hoping to find a blueprint for the revolution he wanted for his own people. But the closer he looked, the more the illusion began to shatter. His journey slowly destroyed his ideological compass. Instead of liberation, he found societies governed by strict conformity and silent fear. He realized that the very freedoms he fought to expand in America, like the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, and the right to dissent, were completely absent in the countries he had idolized. The revolutionary fire inside him began to suffocate under the heavy, cold weight of authoritarian regimes. Paris offered a temporary refuge, but it was a profoundly lonely existence. The French intellectuals who had once celebrated his radical literature eventually moved on to new political trends. He was a man out of time, stripped of his platform, his audience, and his purpose. The strain of a life on the run began to heavily fracture his family. The quiet solitude of his French apartment forced a deep and unexpected psychological reckoning. The anger that had fueled his entire life slowly gave way to a deep spiritual exhaustion. He looked back at the violent rhetoric of his youth and saw the destruction it had left in its wake. He realized he had chased a political mirage that promised salvation but only delivered isolation. In 1975, after 7 long years of wandering in a political desert, he made a decision that shocked the world. He negotiated his surrender and returned to the United States. But the man who stepped off the plane was entirely unrecognizable to those who had once marched in his name. The leather jacket and the defiant beret were gone. Eldridge Cleaver returned not as a fiery revolutionary, but as a born-again Christian. He publicly renounced his radical past, embracing the very democratic systems he had once vowed to destroy. He submitted himself to the American justice system, ready to face the consequences he had fled a decade prior. The ideological shift was absolute and entirely jarring to the public. He began to speak out passionately against the dangers of communism and the moral failures of the radical left. In a move that left his former comrades speechless, he even threw his political support behind conservative figures. He publicly endorsed Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, who had once been his most bitter political enemy. To the radical left, he had committed the ultimate betrayal. They believed he had surrendered to the oppressor to save himself. But to him, He had finally found a truth that radical politics could never provide. He had traveled to the very edges of radical ideology, only to realize that the light he sought was in a different direction. He had gone too far, and the price he paid was the total loss of the world he once ruled. Eldridge Cleaver remains one of the most complex and uncomfortable figures in the history of American civil rights. He was a man who rode his way out of a cold steel cage, only to eventually build a psychological prison of his own making. He reached the absolute summit of cultural influence, demanding justice with a voice that shook the foundations of society. Yet, he spent his final years far away from the flashing cameras and the cheering crowds he once commanded. His legacy is not a simple tale of flawless heroism or absolute villainy. Instead, it is a deeply human portrait of a soul torn between the fire of radical change and a desperate, quiet search for inner peace. He showed a fractured generation how to stand up against the crushing weight of systemic oppression. But his life also serves as a tragic reminder of what happens when the fight consumes the very person it is meant to liberate. Some stories end without closure, but dignity does not need applause. Eldridge Cleaver walked an incredibly lonely road during the final chapters of his life. He bore the heavy, isolating cost of his own spiritual and political evolution. When we look back at the journey of Eldridge Cleaver, we are forced to confront the dangerous edges of any revolution. It is very easy to judge a man who completely reversed his beliefs in front of a watching world. It is much harder to understand the profound exhaustion of fighting a relentless war both inside and outside of your own mind. To anyone who has ever stood alone, choosing to change their path when the entire world demanded they stay the same, we see you. Maybe you have been in a moment like this in your own life. Perhaps not with political exile or national scandal, but with the quiet, terrifying courage required to walk away from a belief system that no longer serves your truth. If the complicated journey of Eldridge Cleaver reminds you of someone you know, or if you have ever had to rebuild your life from the ground up, share your story below. We read every comment. Thank you for walking through this heavy history with us. Take care of your convictions, and take care of each other.